Emily Carter lived a life most people envied. At 34, she was a vice president at one of New York City's most prestigious consulting firms, earning a six-figure salary and living in a luxurious high-rise apartment overlooking Central Park. She was known for her impeccable presentations, her sharp intuition in business strategy, and her ability to close deals that seemed impossible to everyone else. Her colleagues admired her, her clients trusted her, her family often bragged about her. But beneath the polished exterior, Emily was crumbling. Her days began at 5 a.m. with a double shot of espresso, and her nights ended sometime past midnight, with her falling asleep on the couch with her laptop still open. Weekends weren't much better. She spent them preparing for Monday's onslaught of meetings or catching up on emails that she never seemed to get through. Friends and family had learned not to expect much from her. She cancelled dinners, skipped birthdays, and rarely answered texts. She justified it all by telling herself it was temporary, that all the sacrifices were for the life she dreamed of. Success, after all, came at a price. It wasn't until she experienced her first panic attack that Emily began to realize how high that price truly was. She was in the middle of a client presentation, standing in front of a room full of executives when her vision blurred and her chest tightened. Her hands started to tremble and she could barely breathe. For a moment, she thought she was having a heart attack. Excusing herself, she stumbled into the restroom and locked the door behind her. Staring at her reflection in the mirror, she barely recognized the pale, wide-eyed woman looking back. Her mind screamed at her to pull herself together. There were deals to close, targets to hit, but her body refused to cooperate. In the days that followed, Emily tried to convince herself it was just a one-time thing. Too much caffeine, she told herself. Not enough sleep. But the symptoms persisted. She started waking up with a tightness in her chest, her thoughts racing before she even got out of bed. At work, she began forgetting small details, something that had never happened before. One afternoon, she missed a critical deadline, something unthinkable for someone as meticulous as her. Richard Hayes, her boss, pulled her into his office and berated her for slipping. "You're better than this, Emily," he said, his tone sharp and unforgiving. Get it together. But she couldn't get it together. The harder she pushed herself, the worse it got. By the end of the month, Emily felt like a ghost of herself. She was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Detached from her work, her friends, and even herself, she knew something was deeply wrong, but she didn't know how to fix it. And so, like many others caught in the relentless cycle of hustle culture, she kept going, hoping that if she just worked harder, it would all get better. The office where Emily spent most of her waking hours was a towering glass monolith in the heart of Manhattan, an environment as unyielding as the city skyline itself. The firm's culture was merciless. Efficiency and results were prized above all else. Richard Hayes, the managing partner and her direct boss, exemplified this ethos. He was a man whose presence could silence a room. His sharp critiques often delivered in the clipped tone of someone who had no time for incompetence. For years, Emily had thrived under his leadership, mistaking his relentless expectations for a badge of honor. But now every conversation with him felt like a knife twisting in her chest. "Emily," Richard had said during her most recent performance review, his eyes scanning her with an unsettling precision, "your numbers are down this quarter. I need you to step it up. You're one of the best we have, but if you can't deliver, we'll need to reevaluate." She had nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat, and promised herself she would do better. That night she worked until 2 a.m., reviewing financial projections until her vision blurred. Her colleagues weren't much better than Richard. While there were moments of camaraderie, shared late-night takeout orders, and inside jokes during endless project deadlines, the office was largely a battlefield. Promotions were scarce, and alliances shifted constantly as everyone jockeyed for position. Sarah Mitchell, one of the few people Emily considered a friend, often warned her about the toll the job was taking. "You need to slow down, Em," Sarah had said over drinks one evening. "This place eats people alive. Remember Julie? She was the golden girl last year, and now she's in therapy, trying to recover from a total breakdown. Emily had brushed off the comment with a forced laugh, insisting she could handle it. But as weeks turned into months, the isolation Emily felt became suffocating. Outside of work, her personal life had all but vanished. Her parents, who lived in Connecticut, called less often now, tired of leaving unanswered voicemails. Her mother's most recent message had been particularly cutting. "Emily, we haven't seen you in over a year. Are you really too busy to visit your own family? We're worried about you." Emily hadn't replied, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't know what to say. How could she explain that her life was spiraling out of control when she couldn't even admit it to herself? Her romantic life was no better. She had dated a man named Chris for 6 months before he finally ended things. "You're never present," he had said during their last argument. "You're always somewhere else, in your head, in your emails, in your job. I need more than scraps, Emily." His words had stung, but she had buried the hurt, telling herself that relationships could wait, success couldn't. Even the city itself, which she had once loved, felt hostile now. The noise, the rush, the ceaseless energy that had drawn her to New York in her 20s now seemed overwhelming. She avoided the subway whenever possible, choosing to Uber to and from work to avoid the claustrophobic crush of commuters. On weekends, she barely left her apartment, too drained to face the world. Her once pristine living space became cluttered with unopened mail, discarded takeout containers, and empty coffee cups. It was as if her external world was beginning to mirror the chaos inside her mind. One evening, while sorting through a pile of unread emails, Emily stumbled upon a message from Sarah. The subject line read, "Are you okay?" It was a simple note, but it broke something inside her. For the first time in months, Emily allowed herself to cry. Not the quiet, restrained tears she had occasionally shed in the privacy of her bathroom, but deep, racking sobs that the floor of her living room, clutching her knees to her chest, and whispered to herself, "I don't know if I can keep doing this." The next day, Sarah stopped by Emily's office. "You look like hell," she said bluntly, closing the door behind her. Emily forced a weak smile. "Thanks for the pep talk." Sarah didn't laugh. "I'm serious, Em. You're burning out. I've seen it before and I don't want to see it happen to you." For a moment, Emily considered brushing her off, but the concern in Sarah's eyes stopped her. "I don't know how to fix it," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time she had said the words out loud, developing the conflict. The days following Emily's admission to Sarah felt both liberating and terrifying. For the first time, she had acknowledged out loud that something was wrong, but the solution felt elusive. Her work life continued as usual, a relentless cycle of meetings, deadlines, and mounting pressure. The physical symptoms of her burnout intensified. Her hands shook during presentations. She woke up gasping for air in the middle of the night, and a persistent ache settled in her chest like a stone. Her mind was constantly racing, her thoughts tangled in a loop of anxiety and self-doubt. Richard was as demanding as ever. "Emily," he barked during a team meeting, "the Anderson project is falling behind. Fix it." There was no room for discussion, no acknowledgement of the countless hours she had already poured into the account. She wanted to push back, to tell him it was impossible to do everything he demanded, but the words died in her throat. Instead, she nodded and scribbled in her notebook, feeling the familiar weight of his expectations settle on her shoulders. The Anderson project became the flashpoint for everything that followed. The client was one of the firm's biggest accounts, and the stakes were impossibly high. Emily worked late into the night, scrutinizing every detail of the strategy, her perfectionism driving her to double-check even the smallest numbers. But no matter how much effort she put in, it never felt like enough. She skipped meals, ignored texts from Sarah, and avoided calls from her parents. Her life narrowed to a single focus, not failing. One Friday afternoon, with the final presentation due on Monday, Emily stayed at the office long after everyone else had left. The city outside was alive with weekend energy, but inside, the office was silent. the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over her desk. Her laptop screen blurred as she stared at it, exhaustion creeping into every fiber of her being. When she finally closed her laptop at 2:20 a.m., she couldn't remember the last time she had eaten or the last time she had felt truly awake. The breaking point came during the Monday presentation. Emily stood at the head of the conference table, her laptop hooked up to the projector, her slides meticulously prepared. As she began speaking, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room tilted, the faces of the executives blurred, and her voice faltered. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, but the world seemed to spin faster. "Excuse me," she muttered, rushing out of the room before anyone could stop her. In the bathroom, she locked herself in a stall and collapsed onto the floor, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Tears streamed down her face and her mind screamed at her, "You're failing, you're weak, you're not enough." She sat there for what felt like an eternity, too ashamed to return to the meeting, but too paralyzed to leave the building. When she finally emerged, the conference room was empty, the presentation over. Richard's assistant handed her a terse note, "See me in my office." When Emily walked into Richard's office, he didn't bother hiding his frustration. "What happened back there?" he demanded. His tone was sharp, but there was a hint of something else, concern maybe, or irritation that he had to deal with this. I wasn't feeling well," Emily stammered, avoiding his gaze. Richard sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Emily, you're one of our top performers, but lately your work has been slipping. If you can't handle the pressure, maybe this isn't the right place for you." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. For years, she had defined herself by this job, by the approval of people like Richard. But now, she wasn't sure she wanted it anymore. The thought terrified her. Who was she without this job, without the prestige and the title? She left his office without saying a word, her mind spinning with questions she didn't know how to answer. That evening, Sarah came over to Emily's apartment uninvited. "I know you're shutting everyone out, but I'm not letting you do this alone," she said, handing Emily a bag of takeout. They sat on the couch in silence for a while, the weight of the day pressing down on both of them. Finally, Sarah spoke. "You need help, Em. Not just a break. Real help. Therapy, time off. Something." Emily didn't respond immediately. She stared at the food in front of her, her appetite non-existent. But Sarah's words echoed in her mind long after she left. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't something she could fix by working harder. That night, Emily opened her laptop, not to work, but to search for answers. She typed burnout symptoms into Google, and the results felt like reading a description of her own life. She read about emotional exhaustion, detachment, and the physical toll of chronic stress. For the first time, she realized this wasn't just a slump or a rough patch. This was burnout, and it was destroying her. In the days following her breakdown, Emily couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of failure that clung to her like a second skin. The world she had built, her career, her identity, her sense of purpose, felt as though it was crumbling beneath her feet. She spent hours staring at her laptop, paralyzed by indecision. On one hand, she knew she couldn't keep living like this. On the other, she feared what stepping back would mean. How would she face Richard's disappointment? How would she explain herself to her parents, her peers, even Sarah? The questions haunted her, keeping her awake long after the city lights outside her window had dimmed. But something inside her had shifted. For the first time, Emily began to consider the possibility that she didn't have to keep pushing herself to the brink. She had read enough about burnout to know it wasn't something she could fix with a weekend off or a bubble bath. Real recovery would require drastic change, a prospect both terrifying and liberating. One evening, after an especially long therapy session, she opened a blank document on her laptop and began typing a resignation letter. The words flowed easily, almost instinctively, but when she reread them, her chest tightened. She wasn't ready. Not yet. At work, the tension was palpable. Richard's attitude toward her had become colder, more clinical. He stopped inviting her to high-profile meetings and began delegating key projects to her colleagues. Emily knew what he was doing, testing her, watching to see if she would crack under the pressure. The old Emily would have fought tooth and nail to regain his trust, but now she felt oddly detached. She had begun to see the job for what it truly was, a machine designed to chew people up and spit them out. Meanwhile, Sarah remained a constant presence in her life, gently encouraging her to take the leap. One evening, over coffee, Sarah shared a story that Emily had never heard before. "Do you remember Julie, the one who left last year?" Sarah asked. Emily nodded. Julie had been one of the firm's rising stars, a sharp and ambitious consultant who seemed destined for the top. "She almost ended up in the hospital," Sarah continued. "Her burnout got so bad that her doctor told her she was on the verge of a breakdown. So she quit, and now she runs a bakery in Vermont. She says she's never been happier." Emily laughed at the absurdity of it. A bakery? That's such a cliché. But the story stayed with her. She couldn't stop thinking about Julie, about how she had chosen a different path. It made Emily wonder if she could do the same, if there was a version of her life that didn't involve constant exhaustion and anxiety. As Emily grappled with these thoughts, another complication arose. Her parents decided to visit her in New York. They hadn't seen her in over a year, and their sudden arrival felt like an ambush. Her mother, always sharp-eyed and perceptive, immediately noticed the changes in Emily. "You look tired," she said during dinner at a trendy Manhattan bistro. "Are you taking care of yourself?" Emily forced a smile and changed the subject, but her father wasn't so easily deterred. "You know," he said, leaning forward, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone. We're proud of you no matter what." The comment caught Emily off guard. She had spent her entire life trying to live up to their expectations, to be the perfect daughter with the perfect career. Hearing her father say those words felt like a weight lifting off her chest, but it also brought a wave of guilt. Had she been pushing herself for their approval, or was it something deeper, a belief that her worth was tied to her achievements? Over the next few weeks, Emily began making small changes. She started leaving the office at a reasonable hour, ignoring the raised eyebrows and whispered comments from her colleagues. She began declining projects that felt overwhelming, setting boundaries that once seemed impossible. She even told Richard during a tense one-on-one meeting that she wouldn't be available on weekends anymore. His response was predictably dismissive. "We'll see how long that lasts," he said. But Emily didn't rise to the bait. Outside of work, she began to reconnect with herself. She signed up for a painting class, something she hadn't done since college. The first session felt awkward and foreign, her hands clumsy with the brush, but there was a strange sense of satisfaction in creating something purely for herself. She also started attending therapy twice a week, digging deeper into the patterns and beliefs that had driven her to burnout. Dr. Collins encouraged her to think about what she truly wanted from life, beyond the titles and accolades. One day, while flipping through old photos, Emily came across a picture of herself in her early 20s. She was standing on a hiking trail, her face flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with possibility. She barely recognized the woman in the photo, but she felt a pang of longing. She wanted to be that person again, someone who lived with curiosity and joy, not just ambition. The realization was bittersweet, but it also gave her clarity. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to imagine a life outside the firm. It wasn't just about quitting, it was about reclaiming who she was. Emily's tipping point came one morning when she woke up to find her body completely drained. She hadn't slept well in weeks, and her chest felt like it was carrying a lead weight. Even the thought of going into the office filled her with dread. She stared at her ceiling for a long time, her mind replaying the endless loop of tasks awaiting her, the quarterly review, the client's pending revisions, Richard's inevitable critiques. But for the first time, she asked herself a question she had been too afraid to confront. What happens if I just stop? Her answer came in the form of an unplanned act of defiance. Instead of rushing to get ready for work, Emily reached for her phone and sent a single message to Richard. "I'm taking the day off. I'll handle my projects remotely tomorrow." It was the smallest of steps, but it felt monumental. She half expected a storm of emails demanding an explanation, but her inbox remained eerily quiet. No one seemed to notice or care that she wasn't there. And for some reason, that realization stung more than she expected. With an entire day suddenly free, Emily didn't know what to do with herself. After some hesitation, she pulled on an old pair of sneakers and wandered into Central Park. The crisp autumn air wrapped around her like a balm, and for the first time in months, she felt the smallest flicker of peace. She walked aimlessly, her thoughts drifting to the life she had built and the sacrifices it demanded. Was it worth it? The question lingered, heavy and unanswered, but it felt like progress just to acknowledge it. That evening, Emily sat down with a blank notebook, determined to sort through her tangled emotions. She wrote down everything she wanted, honest, unfiltered desires that she hadn't allowed herself to voice in years. Time to breathe, to feel happy when I wake up, a life outside of work. Her pen moved faster as the words poured out, filling the page with thoughts she had buried beneath layers of deadlines and obligations. When she finally set the notebook aside, she felt lighter. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. The next day, Emily returned to the office with a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, she noticed things she had ignored for years. The exhaustion etched on her colleagues' faces, the quiet desperation in their hurried footsteps, the way everyone seemed to measure their worth by how overwhelmed they appeared. It was a system designed to break people, and she had been one of its most willing participants. When Richard called her into his office later that morning, she braced herself for a confrontation. "I heard you took the day off yesterday," he said, his tone clipped. Emily nodded, meeting his gaze with more confidence than she felt. "Yes, I needed it." Richard's eyes narrowed. "We all need a day off, but this isn't the kind of place where people can just disappear. You're a VP, Emily. Act like it." For a moment, Emily felt the old guilt creeping back in. She had spent years bending to the firm's demands, internalizing the belief that her worth was tied to her ability to endure. But this time, she didn't apologize. "I understand," she said calmly, "but I can't keep working like this. It's unsustainable." Richard's expression shifted, the faintest hint of annoyance flickering in his eyes. "If you're feeling overwhelmed, maybe we should talk about redistributing your responsibilities," he said. Though his tone made it clear he wasn't offering a solution, just a veiled threat. Emily's response surprised even herself. "Maybe we should," she said. "Or maybe I need to think about whether this is the right place for me." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Richard stared at her, his usual authority faltering for a brief moment. "Let me know what you decide," he said finally, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. That evening, Emily made an appointment with her therapist, Dr. Collins, who had been guiding her through this journey for months. "I think I might leave," Emily confessed during the session. "The job, the firm, all of it." Dr. Collins nodded, her expression calm and encouraging. "What's stopping you?" Emily hesitated. "Fear," she admitted. "I've spent my whole life chasing this idea of success. If I walk away now, what does that say about me? About everything I've worked for?" Dr. Collins leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "It says you've learned that your worth isn't tied to your job, that you're choosing to protect yourself instead of sacrificing yourself. That's not failure, Emily. That's growth." The words resonated deeply, echoing in Emily's mind as she walked home that night. For years, she had believed that leaving the firm would mean admitting defeat. But now, she was beginning to see it as something else entirely, a chance to reclaim her life. The decision wasn't immediate. Emily spent days weighing her options, talking to Sarah, revisiting her notebook filled with dreams she had once ignored. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She couldn't keep living for a job that consumed her while giving so little in return. One morning, as the sun rose over Manhattan, Emily sat at her desk and opened a blank email. She addressed it to Richard and the board. her fingers trembling slightly as she typed, "After careful consideration, I have decided to step down from my role at the firm. This decision wasn't easy, but it's what I need to move forward in a healthier and more sustainable way. Thank you for the opportunities I've had here. I'll ensure a smooth transition for my departure." When she hit send, a wave of emotion washed over her. Fear, relief, sadness, and hope all colliding at once. For the first time in years, Emily felt like she could breathe. Consequences and reactions. The email sent to Richard and the board set off a chain reaction Emily hadn't fully anticipated. Within hours, her inbox was flooded with responses, some terse and professional, others tinged with genuine surprise. Richard's reply was curt and cold, as she had expected. "Noted. Schedule a meeting with HR to discuss your transition. We'll need your final deliverables by the end of the month." But there were other responses too, ones that caught her off guard. Sarah was the first to call, her voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. "You actually did it," she said, almost laughing. "I didn't think you'd go through with it." Emily smiled faintly, staring out her apartment window at the morning light spilling over the city. "Neither did I," she admitted. The relief in Sarah's voice was palpable. "I'm proud of you, Em. I really am. You're going to be okay." Other colleagues reached out privately, expressing their own frustrations with the firm. One junior analyst wrote, "I don't know how you lasted so long. I admire your courage. I don't think I could ever walk away." These messages brought Emily a strange sense of validation. For years, she had thought she was alone in her struggles, but now she saw that the firm's toxic culture was grinding everyone down. Her decision to leave felt less like a personal failure and more like a stand against something bigger. In the days that followed, Emily experienced a roller coaster of emotions. At first, there was elation, a euphoric sense of freedom as she woke up without the looming dread of deadlines and meetings. She went for long walks in Central Park, rediscovered her favorite coffee shop, and even started painting again. Her first canvas was a chaotic swirl of colors, an abstract representation of the release she felt. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. But as the initial high faded, a new wave of uncertainty crept in. Without the structure of her job, Emily felt untethered. The firm had been her identity for so long that she struggled to figure out who she was without it. Friends would ask, "What's next for you?" And she would stumble over her answer, embarrassed by her lack of a plan. For someone who had always thrived on control and preparation, the ambiguity was unsettling. One particularly difficult moment came during a call with her parents. Her mother, who had always been proud of Emily's career, struggled to understand her decision. "Are you sure this is the right move?" she asked cautiously. "You worked so hard to get where you are. I just don't want you to regret it." Her father chimed in more gently. "We trust you. Whatever you decide, we're behind you." For you, while their support meant a lot, Emily couldn't shake the nagging doubt that she had let them down. Therapy became a lifeline during this period of uncertainty. Dr. Collins helped Emily navigate the tangled emotions that came with such a major life change. "You're grieving," Dr. Collins explained during one session. "Burnout isn't just about physical exhaustion, it's about losing something, your passion, your sense of purpose. And now you're learning to rebuild." Emily nodded, the words resonating deeply. For so long, she had equated her job with her identity. Letting it go felt like losing a part of herself, but it also opened the door to discovering something new. To help her move forward, Dr. Collins encouraged Emily to reframe her thinking. Instead of asking, "What's next?" try asking, "What feels meaningful to me?" You don't need all the answers right now. Focus on the small steps. Taking this advice to heart, Emily began experimenting with activities she had long abandoned. She attended a pottery workshop, went hiking upstate, and even volunteered at an after-school program teaching art to kids. These small moments of joy reminded her that life could exist beyond boardrooms and deadlines. Meanwhile, Emily's departure sent ripples through the office. Sarah kept her updated on the fallout, sharing how Richard had begun delegating Emily's responsibilities to an already overworked team. "He's pretending like everything's fine, but people are noticing," Sarah said during a lunch date. "Your leaving shook things up." Emily listened with mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindicated, knowing her absence had exposed cracks in the system. But another part felt sad for the colleagues she had left behind, still trapped in the grind. Emily's decision also sparked deeper conversations within the firm. During one phone call, Sarah revealed that several employees had approached HR about implementing better mental health policies. "It's slow progress, but it's something," Sarah said. Emily felt a pang of pride, knowing her departure had inspired others to speak up, even if change wouldn't come overnight. As the weeks turned into months, Emily began to find her footing. She started consulting part-time, choosing projects that aligned with her values rather than her paycheck. This new chapter allowed her to use her skills without sacrificing her well-being. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of balance. Her days were no longer consumed by the constant need to prove herself. Instead, they were filled with moments of quiet satisfaction. One evening, as Emily painted in her small studio, she received a text from Sarah. It was a photo of the firm's new employee handbook, featuring a section on work-life balance and mental health resources. The caption read, "You started this." Emily stared at the message, her chest swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. For the first time, she realized that leaving hadn't just been an act of self-preservation. It had been a step towards something greater. Overcoming and growth in the months following her departure, Emily's life transformed in ways she hadn't anticipated. At first, she felt adrift, navigating unfamiliar territory without the safety net of her structured corporate routine. Mornings were especially difficult. Waking up without a rigid schedule left her feeling purposeless. But as the days stretched on, Emily began to embrace the freedom that had once terrified her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to slow down, to breathe, and to truly think about what she wanted from life, not what others expected of her. Therapy became her anchor during this transition. Dr. Collins helped Emily confront the narrative she had internalized for so long, that success was only valid if it came with sacrifice, that rest was a sign of weakness, and that her worth was tied to external validation. "You've been living by other people's definitions of success," Dr. Collins said during one session. "What would your own definition look like?" The question lingered with Emily, sparking a slow but profound shift in her mindset. One morning, as she sat in a quiet corner of her favorite coffee shop, Emily opened her notebook and began to write. She listed the things that truly brought her joy: creating art, spending time in nature, connecting with others in meaningful ways. None of these had anything to do with the corporate ladder she had spent her life climbing. The realization was bittersweet, but it also felt like a doorway to something new. Emily began exploring these interests with a sense of curiosity she hadn't felt in years. She enrolled in an art class at a local studio, rediscovering her love for painting. Her first few attempts were clumsy, her hands stiff from years of disuse, but the act of creating felt liberating. She lost herself in the colors and textures, finding solace in the imperfections of her work. Her apartment slowly filled with canvases, each one a testament to her rediscovered passion. She also began spending more time outdoors. Weekends that were once consumed by endless meetings and emails were now dedicated to hiking trips and quiet walks along the Hudson River. On one particularly crisp autumn day, Emily found herself sitting on a rock overlooking the water, sketching the trees as their leaves turned shades of orange and gold. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt fully present. Through these small but significant changes, Emily started to rebuild her sense of self. She reconnected with friends she had drifted away from, apologizing for her past absences and making an effort to be more present in their lives. She visited her parents in Connecticut for an extended weekend, spending hours talking with them over cups of coffee and home-cooked meals. Her mother, who had once struggled to understand Emily's decision to leave her job, now expressed pride in her daughter's bravery. "You seem happier," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "That's all we've ever wanted for you." Professionally, Emily began carving out a new path for herself. At first, she dabbled in freelance consulting, taking on small projects that aligned with her values. Her first client was a non-profit organization focused on environmental sustainability, a stark contrast to the corporate giants she had once worked for. The work was challenging but fulfilling, and Emily found herself energized by the opportunity to use her skills for a cause she believed in. As her confidence grew, she started mentoring young professionals who were struggling with the same pressures she had faced. Through informal coffee chats and virtual workshops, she shared her story, emphasizing the importance of balance and self-care. Her authenticity resonated with people, and before long she was invited to speak at events and panels about her journey. Standing in front of audiences, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just telling her story, she was helping others navigate their own. One evening, as she prepared for a speaking engagement, Emily reflected on how far she had come. Her life now looked nothing like the one she had envisioned in her 20s, but for the first time, she felt at peace with that. The version of herself she had once strived to be, polished, perfect, perpetually successful, had been a facade. The person she was becoming now felt real, grounded, and whole. Emily's growth wasn't linear. There were moments of doubt, times when she questioned whether she had made the right choice. Seeing old colleagues on LinkedIn announcing promotions and achievements sometimes triggered pangs of insecurity. But those feelings were fleeting, replaced by the quiet contentment she felt in her new life. Instead of chasing titles, she was chasing fulfillment. Instead of measuring her worth by her productivity, she was learning to value herself simply for being. Her art, once a forgotten hobby, became a cornerstone of her new identity. After months of practice, she showcased her work at a local gallery's community event. Standing among her paintings, surrounded by strangers admiring her creations, Emily felt a sense of pride that had nothing to do with numbers or accolades. It was a different kind of success, one that felt entirely her own. As her life blossomed, Emily noticed something else. She had become an agent of change. Her decision to leave the firm had inspired others to reevaluate their own priorities. Sarah, who'd been her closest confidant at work, eventually followed in her footsteps, moving to a smaller company with a healthier work culture. Emily's mentees often wrote to her, thanking her for her guidance and sharing how her story had encouraged them to set boundaries and seek balance. One night, as Emily sat by her window, sketching the skyline of Manhattan, she realized she no longer felt the same weight she once had. The city, which had once seemed overwhelming, now felt like a canvas of opportunity. She wasn't running anymore, she was moving forward with intention. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and for Emily, that was enough. Emily's newfound balance was fragile, and she knew it. Though she'd come far in rediscovering her passions and reclaiming her identity, the shadow of her past life at the firm lingered. Emails from former colleagues still popped up occasionally, reminders of the world she had once inhabited. Most were harmless updates or invitations to networking events, but one email changed everything. It was from Richard. The subject line was abrupt as always, consulting opportunity. Emily hesitated before opening it, her heart sinking as her mind raced. The email was short and to the point. Emily, we have a significant client crisis and need someone with your expertise. No one knows this account like you do. If you're willing to consult, name your terms. The offer was shocking. After months of silence, Richard was reaching out to her, not with criticism, but with a request for help. Emily stared at the screen, her emotions colliding, flattery, anger, and a creeping sense of self-doubt. Why now? Why her? And more importantly, could she trust herself to step back into the world she had worked so hard to leave behind? Emily wrestled with the decision for days. The logical side of her was tempted. The pay would be significant. and it was an opportunity to prove that she hadn't left the firm because she wasn't capable. But another part of her, the one that had worked tirelessly to rebuild her life, was wary. What if returning, even temporarily, pulled her back into the toxic cycle she had just escaped? She brought the dilemma to Dr. Collins. "I don't know what to do," Emily admitted during their session. "Part of me wants to say yes. I know I can handle it this time, but part of me is terrified." Dr. Collins nodded thoughtfully. "What are you afraid of?" Emily hesitated before answering. "That I'll lose myself again. That I'll get sucked back into that world and forget everything I've learned." Dr. Collins leaned forward, her expression calm but firm. "Emily, the fact that you're asking these questions shows how much you've grown. You don't have to prove anything to Richard or anyone else. But if you choose to take this on, you have the tools now to set boundaries and protect yourself." Those words stayed with Emily as she mulled over her decision. She knew Dr. Collins was right. The situation wasn't about Richard or the firm. It was about her. Could she confront her past without letting it consume her? Eventually, Emily made a decision. She replied to Richard's email with a clear, concise message. "I'm willing to consult on this project under specific conditions. I'll set my own schedule, work remotely, and have final approval over the deliverables. If these terms are acceptable, let me know." To her surprise, Richard agreed without hesitation. "You're still the best," he wrote. The comment felt hollow, but Emily chose to focus on the opportunity rather than his intentions. This time, she would do things on her terms. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The project was demanding, with tight deadlines and high stakes, but Emily approached the work differently this time. She stuck to the boundaries she had set, logging off at 6 p.m. every day and refusing to answer emails over the weekend. She even turned down a request for a last-minute meeting, something the old Emily would never have done. Each decision felt like a small victory, a reminder that she was no longer the person who had let her job define her worth. As the project neared completion, Emily faced one final challenge, presenting her findings to the firm's leadership team and the client. The presentation was scheduled to take place in the firm's main conference room, the same room where she had once suffered her first panic attack. Walking into that space again felt surreal. The memories of that day lingered at the edges of her mind, but she pushed them aside, focusing instead on how far she had come. When Richard greeted her before the meeting, his tone was uncharacteristically warm. "Good to see you, Emily," he said, shaking her hand. "We've missed having you here." Emily met his gaze steadily. "I'm glad to help," she replied, her voice calm but professional. She wasn't here for him, she reminded herself. She was here because she had chosen to be. As the presentation began, Emily felt a familiar tension in her chest, but this time she knew how to manage it. She took a deep breath, grounded herself, and began to speak. The words flowed easily, her confidence growing with each slide. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, and several clients approached her afterward to commend her work. Richard, too, was impressed. "You knocked it out of the park," he said, his tone unusually generous. "If you ever want to come back, you know the door's open." Emily smiled faintly, but her answer was firm. "Thank you, Richard, but I'm happy where I am now." Walking out of the conference room, Emily felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. She had faced her past and proven to herself, not to Richard or anyone else, that she could thrive on her own terms. The firm no longer held power over her, and for the first time, she felt truly free. The sun was setting over Manhattan as Emily exited the firm's office building, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air. The door she had walked out of months ago, unsure if she'd ever return, now swung closed behind her with finality. She paused for a moment on the sidewalk, taking in the sounds of the bustling city around her. The presentation was a success, better than she could have hoped for, but that wasn't what lingered in her mind. For the first time in years, she had walked into that room as herself, not as a version of someone she thought she needed to be. Still, the experience had been emotionally taxing. Walking into the office again had unearthed memories she thought she had left behind. The sleepless nights, the suffocating pressure, the desperate need to prove her worth, all of it had bubbled to the surface during those few hours back in her old environment. But this time, Emily had faced it without flinching. She had spoken confidently, set clear boundaries, and left on her terms. As she walked toward her apartment, her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Heard you crushed it today. Drink soon to celebrate." Emily smiled, typing back a quick, "Absolutely." For the first time in a long time, the idea of celebrating felt natural, not forced. The days following the presentation brought a strange sense of finality. Richard's offer to return to the firm lingered in her mind, not because she was tempted, but because it solidified how far she had come. A year ago, she might have jumped at the chance, desperate for the validation she had always sought from him and the firm. Now, she saw it for what it was, an empty invitation to re-enter a world she no longer belonged to. Emily's sense of closure deepened when she received a call from one of the junior analysts she had mentored before leaving. "Hi, Emily," the young woman said, her voice hesitant but warm. "I just wanted to thank you. After you left, I started thinking about how much I've been struggling with the same things you talked about. I finally worked up the courage to talk to HR about my workload. It's not perfect yet, but things are improving. I don't think I would have done it if I hadn't seen you take that step first." The call left Emily feeling both proud and emotional. Her decision to leave hadn't just been an act of self-preservation. It had sent ripples through the firm, encouraging others to re-evaluate their own boundaries. She realized now that her departure had been more impactful than she could have imagined. One of the most transformative moments came during a conversation with Dr. Collins. "I think I'm finally ready to stop looking back," Emily confessed during the session. "For months, I've been carrying this fear that leaving the firm meant I was walking away from everything I worked for. But now, I see it differently. I wasn't walking away. I was choosing myself for the first time in years." Dr. Collins smiled warmly. "And how does that feel?" Emily thought for a moment before answering. "It feels liberating, like I'm not chasing anything anymore. I'm just living." That conversation marked a turning point for Emily. She began to embrace her new life with a sense of purpose that had been missing before. She stopped comparing herself to her old colleagues on LinkedIn, stopped measuring her worth by titles and accolades. Instead, she focused on the things that brought her genuine joy: her art, her connections with others, and the small, quiet moments of peace she had once overlooked. The final thread of her transformation came one evening when she received an invitation to an alumni panel at her old university. The topic was redefining success in the modern workplace, and the organizers wanted her to share her story. At first, Emily hesitated. Speaking publicly about her burnout and decision to leave the firm felt vulnerable, almost too personal. But then she remembered the analyst's phone calls, the messages from her mentees, the ripple effects of her decision. Her story mattered, and sharing it might help others. The event took place in a bright, modern auditorium filled with eager young professionals. As Emily took the stage, she felt a flicker of nervousness, but quickly steadied herself. "For years," she began, "I defined success by how much I could achieve, how hard I could push myself, and how well I could meet other people's expectations. It took me reaching the point of total burnout to realize that success without balance isn't success at all." She went on to talk about her journey, her struggles, her fears, and her eventual decision to leave the firm. The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. When she finished, there was a long pause before the room erupted into applause. Several attendees approached her afterward, sharing their own stories of burnout and thanking her for her honesty. As Emily left the auditorium that evening, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Her story, once a source of shame, had become a source of strength, not just for herself, but for others. She had turned her pain into something meaningful, something bigger than herself. Walking back to her apartment, Emily reflected on how far she had come. Her life was no longer dictated by deadlines and deliverables, by the relentless pressure to prove herself. Instead, it was defined by choice, the choice to live authentically, to pursue what mattered most, and to let go of the things that didn't. The city lights glittered around her, the same lights that had once felt suffocating. Now, they seemed almost welcoming, a reminder of the endless possibilities that lay ahead. Emily smiled to herself, a quiet, contented smile. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. Emily's life, once dominated by the relentless grind of corporate ambition, had settled into a rhythm of her own design. Mornings were now calm and unhurried, filled with the comforting rituals she had neglected for years. She would wake with the sunrise, brew a cup of coffee, and sit by her window overlooking the bustling streets of Manhattan. It was her favorite part of the day, a time to reflect, to sketch, or simply to be. The version of herself who once rushed out the door, already burdened by emails and expectations, felt like a distant memory. Her career, too, had shifted in ways that surprised even her. After the alumni panel, Emily began receiving invitations to speak at other events, podcasts, and workshops. She became known as an advocate for mental health and work-life balance in high-pressure industries. What started as an act of catharsis, sharing her story, evolved into a purpose-driven path. People often reached out after her talks, thanking her for articulating the struggles they had been too afraid to voice. It was deeply rewarding work, and for the first time, Emily felt that her success wasn't about climbing a ladder. It was about helping others find balance on their own terms. Emily also found herself reconnecting with the people and passions she had once abandoned. Her parents, who had been skeptical of her decision to leave the firm, now expressed pride in her new life. During one visit to their home in Connecticut, her father handed her an article he had clipped from a business magazine. The headline read, "Breaking the Hustle Culture, One Woman's Journey to Redefine Success." It was an interview Emily had given a few weeks prior. "You've come a long way, kiddo," her father said, his voice warm with admiration. Emily smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thanks, Dad," she replied, realizing how much their support had meant to her during the hardest moments. Her art, once a forgotten hobby, became a cornerstone of her life. She continued painting in her small studio, experimenting with abstract techniques in bold colors. Her work, which she initially created for herself, began attracting attention from local galleries. One gallery owner approached her at an open house and asked if she'd be interested in showcasing her pieces in a group exhibition. The thought of sharing such a personal part of herself was daunting, but Emily accepted. The exhibition was a success, and seeing her work displayed on the walls of a gallery felt like reclaiming a part of herself she had lost long ago. One night, Emily sat in her studio reflecting on the path that had led her here. She thought about the younger version of herself, the ambitious, driven woman who had once believed that success meant sacrificing everything else. That version of Emily had fought tirelessly for a seat at the table, only to realize too late that the table wasn't worth the cost. Letting go of that life had felt like losing everything at first, but now she saw it differently. She hadn't lost anything. She had made space for something better. The old Emily might have envied the accomplishments of her former colleagues who were still climbing the corporate ladder, but the Emily of today felt no need for comparison. Her success looked different now. It wasn't measured by titles or accolades, but by the simple, profound sense of fulfillment she felt in her everyday life. Success, she realized, wasn't about how much she could achieve. It was about how aligned her achievements were with her values. Her friendships, too, had deepened in unexpected ways. Sarah remained one of her closest confidants, and their bond had only strengthened since Emily left the firm. Over drinks one evening, Sarah shared her own plans to step back from the grind. "You inspired me," Sarah admitted, swirling the last of her wine. "Seeing you walk away made me realize I don't have to stay stuck. I've been interviewing with smaller companies that actually value work-life balance." Emily swell of pride. "You deserve to be happy, Sarah," she said. "Don't let them tell you otherwise." On a quiet Sunday morning, Emily received an email from the non-profit she had consulted for shortly after leaving the firm. They wanted her to join their board of directors, citing her passion and strategic expertise as invaluable assets. The offer was a perfect fit, combining her professional skills with her personal values. She accepted without hesitation, excited to contribute to a cause she believed in. It was yet another reminder that leaving her old life had opened doors she never could have imagined. That evening, Emily stood by her window, watching the city lights glitter against the dark sky. She thought about how much her perspective had changed over the past year. The city that had once felt suffocating now felt alive with possibility. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first came to New York, nor the person she was when she left the firm. She was someone entirely new, someone stronger, more grounded, and more at peace with herself. As she closed her notebook for the night, Emily wrote one final thought at the bottom of the page. Success isn't about what you sacrifice, it's about what you choose to embrace. For the first time, the words felt true. At 34, she was a vice president at one of New York's most prestigious consulting firms, earning a six-figure salary and living in a luxurious apartment overlooking Central Park. Emily was known for her flawless presentations, her keen intuition for business strategy, and her ability to close deals that seemed impossible for anyone else. Her colleagues admired her, her clients trusted her, her family frequently bragged about her accomplishments, but behind the flawless facade, Emily was falling apart. Her days began at 5 in the morning with a double latte and ended after midnight, often with her falling asleep on the couch, her laptop still open. Weekends weren't much better. She spent them preparing for Monday's onslaught of meetings or answering endless emails. Friends and family learned not to expect much from her. Emily would cancel dinners, forget birthdays, and rarely respond to messages. She justified it all by telling herself that it was temporary, that all the sacrifices were for the lifestyle she dreamed of. After all, success had its price. It wasn't until her first panic attack that Emily began to realize just how high the price was. In the middle of a client presentation, in front of a room full of executives, her vision blurred and her chest tightened. Her hands began to shake, and she could barely breathe. For a moment, she thought she was having a heart attack. Excusing herself, she stumbled to the bathroom and locked the door behind her. When she glanced in the mirror, she barely recognized the pale, wide-eyed woman staring back at her. Her mind screamed at her to pull herself together. There were deals to be closed, goals to be met, but her body refused to cooperate. In the days that followed, Emily tried to convince herself that it was a one-time thing. Too much caffeine, she told herself. Not enough sleep, but the symptoms persisted. She began waking up with a tightness in her chest, her thoughts racing before she could even get out of bed. At work, she began to forget small details, something she'd never done before. One afternoon, he missed the deadline for a critical delivery, something unthinkable for someone as meticulous as she was. Richard Hayes, her boss, called her into his office and gave her a stern reprimand. "You're better than this, Emily," he said, his tone cold and unforgiving. "Get it together." But she couldn't get it together. The harder she tried, the worse things got. By the end of the month, Emily felt like a ghost of her former self. She was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix, disconnected from work, from her friends, and most of all from herself. Emily knew something was deeply wrong, but she didn't know how to fix it. And so, like so many others trapped in the relentless cycle of overwork culture, she kept going, hoping that if she just worked harder, everything would be okay. The office where Emily spent most of her waking hours was a glass monolith in the heart of Manhattan, an environment as unforgiving as the city skyline. The firm's culture was cutthroat, efficiency and results were paramount. Richard Hayes, Emily's managing partner and direct boss, embodied that philosophy. He was the kind of man whose presence could silence a room, his sharp critiques often delivered in a clipped tone, as if he had no time to deal with incompetence. For years, Emily had thrived under his leadership, mistaking his unrelenting expectations for a badge of honor. But now, every conversation with him felt like a knife twisting in her chest. "Emily," Richard had said during her most recent performance review, his eyes scanning her with uncomfortable precision, "your numbers are down this quarter. I need you to improve. You're one of the best we have, but if you can't deliver, we'll have to reevaluate." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat, and promised herself she would do better. That night, he worked until 2 in the morning, reviewing financial projections until his vision blurred. Her colleagues weren't much better off than Richard. While there were moments of camaraderie, late-night food orders and inside jokes during endless project deadlines, the office was largely a battlefield. Promotions were scarce, and alliances shifted constantly as everyone jockeyed for position. Sarah Mitchell, one of the few people Emily considered a friend, frequently warned her about the toll the job was taking. "You need to slow down, Em," Sarah had said over happy hour. "This place burns you out. Remember Julie? She was the star last year, and now she's in therapy, trying to recover from a total breakdown." Emily laughed wryly, insisting that she could handle it. But as the weeks turned into months, Emily's sense of isolation became suffocating. Outside of work, her personal life had all but disappeared. Missing. Her parents, who lived in Connecticut, called less often now, tired of leaving unanswered messages. Her mother's most recent message was particularly painful. "Emily, we haven't seen each other in over a year. Are you really so busy that you can't visit your own family? We're worried about you." Emily didn't respond, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't know what to say. How could she explain that her life was spiraling out of control when she couldn't even admit it to herself? Her love life wasn't any better either. She'd dated a man named Chris for 6 months before he finally broke it off. "You're never there," he'd said during their last argument. "You're always somewhere else, in your head, in your emails, at your work. I need more than crumbs, Emily." His words stung, but she buried the pain, telling herself that relationships could wait. Success couldn't. Even the city she'd once loved now felt hostile. The noise, the hustle and bustle, the relentless energy that had drawn her to New York in her early 20s now felt oppressive. She avoided the subway whenever possible, opting instead for Ubers to and from work to avoid the claustrophobic crush of other passengers. On the weekends, she barely left her apartment, too exhausted to face the world. Her once impeccable space had become cluttered with unopened mail, discarded food wrappers and empty coffee cups. It was as if her outside world had begun to mirror the chaos inside her mind. One night, while sorting through a pile of unread emails, Emily came across a message from Sarah. The subject line read, "Are you okay?" It was a simple note, but something inside Emily snapped. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry, not held back tears, but deep, uncontrolled sobs that left her breathless. She sat on the living room floor, hugging her knees and whispering to herself, "I don't know if I can go on like this." The next day, Sarah showed up at Emily's office unannounced. "You look like hell," she said bluntly, closing the door behind her. Emily forced a weak smile. "Thanks for the compliment." Sarah didn't laugh. "I'm serious, Em. You're burning out all your strength. I've seen it before, and I don't want to see that happen to you." For a moment, Emily considered ignoring her, but the concern in Sarah's eyes stopped her. "I don't know how to fix this," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time she had said those words out loud.